Hello,
Hello.
Dr. Waldinger, Robert. My name is Mónica Esgueva. I am an expert in mindfulness and personal development, and I am delighted to be here with you today to talk about a really important issue here, which is happiness.
Well, I'm very glad to be here too. Thank you for having me.
Robert, could you tell us a little bit more about this study that you have started at Harvard many decades ago? It's the longest study on human behavior and happiness. Can you explain to us a little bit more about it?
Yes, I am actually the fourth director of the study. It was started in 1938, and it began as two separate research studies, and the studies were not aware of each other. Both started at Harvard. One study was a study of Harvard College undergraduate students, 19-year-old young men who were chosen by their professors as fine, upstanding examples of manhood. And it was meant to be a study of how people progress from adolescence into young adulthood. It was meant to be a study of normal young adult development. Now we smile at this because if you want to study normal young adult development, you don't just restrict yourself to white males from Harvard University. But at that time, that's what they did. And it was meant to be a study of thriving. At the same time, at Harvard Law School, a law professor, Sheldon Gluck, and his spouse, a social worker named Eleanor Gluck, were interested in juvenile delinquency. They were interested in particularly how some children born into very difficult circumstances, very troubled families, how those children managed to stay out of trouble, managed to stay on good developmental paths. So again, it was a study of thriving, but it was a study of very disadvantaged young people. And then my predecessor, George Valiant, put these two studies together. So we had one very disadvantaged group, one very privileged group. But what was unusual about the studies at the time was that they were not studies of what goes wrong. Most research is on illness, right? And problems in human development so that we can help people who have those problems. This was a study of what predicts who's going to thrive in life. And then eventually we brought in all these young men's partners, their spouses, and now we've brought in their children. So we have more than half women in the study and over 2,000 people, 724 families altogether. And we're now in our 85th year. It's the longest study of the same families that's ever been done in the history of science. What we found when we were looking at the predictors of what helps people live longer, healthier lives and happier lives, we found something that surprised us, which is that good, warm connections with other people actually make us happier. Yes, that's not a surprise, but they also keep us healthier. And by contrast, people who are lonely, people who are more socially isolated, develop the diseases of aging earlier, and they live shorter lives than people who are not lonely and who have good social connections. In the beginning, we didn't believe our own data. We thought, how could this be? Like, it makes sense that we would be happier if we have warmer relationships, but how could warmer relationships predict that we would be less likely to develop coronary artery disease or arthritis or type 2 diabetes? How could that be possible? And then many other studies began to find the same thing. And that's important because no single study can itself prove a finding like this, that we need many studies to point at the same thing. And then we can have confidence that this is a scientific truth. And now it's a very well-established finding that good relationships actually promote physical health and longevity. So then, how does that work? We've been spending the last 10 years in our laboratory trying to understand how that works. And the best hypothesis we have is that relationships protect us from chronic stress. We know that life is always bringing stressful events, right? I mean, we're having a nice conversation now, but an hour from now, something stressful may happen to me and I'll be upset and my body will change. My body goes into what we call fight or flight mode, where the heart rate increases, I might start to sweat, I might start to breathe more quickly. And what we know is that then circulating stress hormones increase, inflammation increases. That's all normal. It's good for the body to be able to do that, to deal with stress. But then the body is meant to return to equilibrium when the stressor is removed. And you've probably had the experience that when something upsetting happens, but you can go home and talk to a friend, or if I can go home and complain to my wife, I can literally feel my body calm down. And that's what's supposed to happen. We believe that what happens with lonely people, with isolated people, is that they never quite return to their equilibrium, to their baseline. That instead, they're in a kind of low-level fight or flight mode much of the time. So they have higher levels of stress hormones, higher levels of chronic inflammation, and those things break down body systems over time. So that's how relationships could affect our coronary arteries, and they could affect our joints, for example. And so it's a way that relationships help us regulate negative emotions.
Some people are introverts, some people are extroverts. Can you give us some tools for people to strengthen their relationships regardless of their personality?
It's very important for us to talk about this because we're all on a spectrum from being very shy, very introverted, to being extroverted. And being shy is perfectly normal and just fine. In our culture, particularly I know in the United States, we prioritize extroversion. We think extroversion is great, but actually there's nothing special about being extroverted, and there are many good things about being shy. What we know is that introverts need fewer people in their lives to feel content, to feel happy, that they get their energy, they get refreshed from being alone, from having a lot of alone time. Extroverts get their energy from other people, so they need more people in their lives, but neither one is normal or abnormal. So what we believe is that whether you're introverted or extroverted, everybody needs at least one or two relationships that we call securely attached relationships, where people feel like there's someone there who they can trust to call on, to be there for them. In our study with our participants, we asked them at one point, who could you call in the middle of the night if you were sick or scared? And list all the people you could call. And most of our participants had several people they could list, but some of our participants couldn't list anyone. And a few of those participants were married, and they didn't list anyone that they could call in the middle of the night. We believe that everybody, whether you're shy or a real party animal, that everybody needs one or two relationships that are secure, safe relationships like that. And then the rest depends on you, your personality, your temperament, what you need. So shy people may simply want to cultivate and pay close attention to a few people and maintaining those relationships. People who are more extroverted may want to join more clubs, may want to be in situations where there are more people around. So for example, I mean, I don't like loud, noisy clubs with very loud music and lots of dancing, but my younger son loves those clubs, and he goes to those clubs all the time. In fact, he loves being in Madrid. He loves visiting Madrid because there are lots of those clubs in Madrid. And so we're very different temperamentally, and that's fine. That's one of the things that makes life interesting and makes our relationships interesting.
Robert, in life, there are many things that lie outside of our control, and sometimes those things that happen do affect us.
Yeah.
And there are many people out there that think that because of their circumstances or their limitations, they cannot do much about their own happiness. What can you say about this?
There's actually some good science about this. There was a study by a psychologist named Sonia Lubomirsky, and she wanted to estimate how much of our happiness is under our control. And so she took a lot of data from many different studies. And in her estimation, about 50% of our happiness, of our mood, is genetically influenced. It's inborn temperament. So about 50% is not under our control. And we all know people who are like always cheerful no matter what, even when terrible things happen. And we know other people who are always gloomy, even when everything is fine, right? And that's just inborn temperament. So Lubomirsky estimates that about half of our happiness is that inborn temperament. And she estimates that about 10% of our happiness is due to our particular life circumstances right now. So if I'm in a very bad situation, and then about 40% of our happiness is under our control. We can improve that. And that's important because 40% is a large amount. Yeah. And so we can do all kinds of things to build happier lives. But there is this kind of bedrock of mood, of temperament, of personality that we're all born with. We sometimes call it a happiness set point.
It's almost like an inclination, right?
Yeah.
In your study, you ask participants at the end of their lives, what do they regret the most?
Yeah.
Can you share that with us today?
When our original participants got to be about age 80, we said, look back on your life and tell us, what do you regret the most? What are you proudest of? And what the men regretted most often was spending too much time at work and not spending enough time with the people they cared about. And it's a cliche, nobody on their deathbed ever wished that they had spent more time at the office, right? And it's a cliche for a reason, because many people feel this way. Many of the women in our study said that they most regretted that they had spent so much time worrying about what other people thought, what other people's opinions of them, other people's opinions about what was right and wrong, and that they wished that they had lived more authentic lives. But when we asked people what they were proudest of, almost everyone mentioned their relationships. So they mentioned, I was a good boss, I was a good parent, I was a good friend, I was a good mentor. Almost nobody said, I won the Nobel Prize, or I became a billionaire, and we had many famous, rich people, right? But nobody mentioned those things. They mentioned the quality of their relationships.
So I guess when we get to the end of our lives, we get to be closer to what really matters.
Yeah, yeah.
I would like to ask you a more personal question. What do you do in your life to feel more fulfilled, to feel happier?
I am a Zen practitioner, so I meditate, and I find that very helpful. It does help me feel happier, more grounded. I spend a lot of time with people. I've had to learn from my own research how important it is to spend time with people, and so now I really make an effort to connect, to make sure I connect with my close friends. I spend time in nature. I find that spending time outdoors, especially if I meditate outdoors, it's really helpful. I mean, spending time just looking at a tree for 10 minutes is a wonderful experience. If you really give your full attention to that tree, you see so much. Or watching birds. I mean, it's incredible. So those are some of the things that make me happiest now. And I really like travel. Actually, I've loved coming to Madrid. My wife and I both really enjoy seeing new places, meeting people, that kind of thing.
Robert, besides being a psychiatrist, a researcher, a professor, you are also a Zen teacher. According to Zen, what are the things that are conducive to having a good life?
According to Zen, the good life is being awake in the present moment. It's paying attention to whatever is here right now in the present. Not worrying about the future, not worrying about the past, just being here and being present for whatever comes up. And that, according to Zen, is nirvana. That is enlightenment. Nothing fancier than that.
But it's also very difficult.
Yes, it is difficult.
So what would you give, like, some advice to people to do that more often? Because this is something that is very difficult in our society, where there is so much distraction and everything is fighting for our attention. How would you do that?
Yeah. Well, meditation is not something that everybody should do. So, for example, my wife has no interest in meditation. She loves the fact that I'm a meditator and she supports me in doing it. She says that it makes me a much better listener and it makes me a better husband, but she has no interest. But she loves music and she loses herself in playing the piano, in singing. And so that is the place where she finds a kind of engagement with the present moment. And what I think everyone should find, if they can, is something that allows them to be very present in the moment. Sometimes we call it a state of flow, and that it could be skiing down a ski slope. It could be working in a garden. It could be any number of things. And it's that experience where you're just in the activity and time seems to pass by without your even being aware of it. And that's that state of absorption, we call it, that many people can find. Some of us find it in meditation, but you don't have to meditate to find it. There are many ways to find it.
I am very curious about something, Robert. How open are institutions such as Harvard about meditation and spirituality? I know that in the past, for example, Daniel Goleman or Richard Davidson had to hide that part of themselves, or Ram Dass had to quit teaching there altogether. Has this changed nowadays in the last few years?
It has definitely changed. When I started my Zen practice, I kept it hidden. I was afraid that no one would take me seriously as a scientist if they thought I had this spiritual practice. But what's clear now is, first of all, we realize that spiritual life is a very helpful contributor to our well-being, right? And so for some of us, not for everyone, many people don't feel the need for a spiritual life, but some of us do, many of us do. We also know from good scientific research that spiritual practices help many people. They are good for our physical health, they're good for our mental health. So in that sense, there's also scientific evidence that spiritual practices matter in the world. And I think for that reason, there's less prejudice in the academic world. For example, in Harvard, prejudice against spirituality and religion. And what I know now is that I've learned that when I ask my patients, so I work with patients every day in psychotherapy, when I ask my patients about their spiritual lives, first of all, they're relieved because they don't know if it's okay to talk about that in psychotherapy, and then they open up and they want to talk about it. They want to talk about their beliefs and about how they practice, what they practice. And so what I find is that the more open I am about that, I don't tell my patients all the details about my spiritual practice, but I'm very clear that I'm a Zen practitioner, and I think for that reason, many people feel comfortable talking to me about their religion or their spirituality.
Well, Robert, it has been such a pleasure to be here with you and speaking about all these very interesting topics. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. It's been a really interesting interview.